September 1983. A convoy of trucks pulls into a municipal landfill outside Alamogordo, New Mexico. City officials counted 14 loads. Atari's own people said it was closer to 20. They dumped everything. Then they poured concrete on top of it. For 31 years, people said that story was made up. On April 26, 2014, a film crew and a team of archaeologists dug into that landfill and found it. About 1,300 cartridges, 30 feet down, under the concrete. Here is what nobody tells you. Only about 1 in 10 of them was ET. So the story you know, that one terrible video game killed the biggest consumer electronics company in America, isn't exaggerated. It's wrong. The thing that killed Atari happened 4 years earlier, in a meeting, and it took 90 seconds. This is Bygonomics. You have to understand how big this company was, because nothing in the story makes sense otherwise. In 1976, Warner Communications bought Atari for $28 million. At the time, Atari's revenue was about $40 million a year. It made a table tennis machine. 6 years later, Atari was half of Warner's $2.9 billion in revenue and a third of its operating profit. 10,000 people worked there. 12 million American households owned an Atari 2600, a plastic box with a wood grain sticker on the front and a slot in the top. That slot is the whole story. Everything Atari earned came out of what people pushed into it. So hold on to one question for the next 10 minutes. Who decides what goes in the slot? In February 1978, Warner sent in a new president for the consumer division. His name was Ray Kassar. Kassar was not a games person. He'd spent his career at Burlington Industries, textiles, bed sheets. He was very good at it. He understood forecasting, inventory, retail shelf space, the difference between what you make and what you can move. And he walked into a building full of people who did not work that way at all. An Atari game in 1979 was written by one person, one, alone. The code, the graphics, the sound, the whole thing squeezed into 4 kilobytes, less memory than the text of this sentence. No credit screen, no name on the box. Atari's position was that the box said Atari, and that was that. 4 of those programmers were about to test that position. Their names were David Crane, Larry Kaplan, Alan Miller, and Bob Whitehead. Between them, they had written the games that accounted for roughly 60% of Atari's cartridge sales. 60%. 4 people. In May 1979, they went to see Kassar, and they made a request that sounds completely obvious now and sounded insane then. Treat us the way a record label treats musicians. Give us a royalty on what we sell, and put our names on the box. What Kassar reportedly told them was that they were no different from the people on the line who put the cartridges into the boxes. Then he went to a newspaper and called them high-strung prima donnas. He was talking about 4 men who at that moment were 60% of his revenue. And he had just explained to them, out loud, exactly how much leverage they had. On October 1st, 1979, they founded Activision. It was the first third-party publisher in the history of the industry. Not the first rival console maker, something new. A company that made software for hardware it didn't own and hadn't been invited to. And they did the thing they'd asked for. The Activision boxes had the programmer's name on them, the manuals had photographs of the men who wrote the code, and letters signed by them. They put a face on software 5 years before anybody thought that was a product decision. The games were also, inconveniently for Atari, better. Pitfall sold over 4 million copies. River Raid, Kaboom. Freeway, written by the same 4 people who used to write Atari's hits, because they were still the same 4 people. Atari's response was not to compete, it was to sue. In 1980, Atari sued Activision for copyright and patent infringement. The claim, in plain language, nobody but us may make a cartridge for our machine. Now, stop and look at that sentence, because it is where the company dies. Atari was asserting a right it had never built. The Atari 2600 had no lockout, no authentication chip, no key, no handshake, nothing. You put a cartridge in the slot and the machine ran whatever was on it. Once the hardware documentation got out, there was no technical reason anyone on Earth couldn't make a game for it. Atari had shipped 12 million machines with the door wide open, and its only lock was a lawyer, which is fine, right up until the day a court looks at the lawyer. In 1982, Atari settled. The terms were, on paper, a win. Activision would pay Atari a royalty on every cartridge it sold. Money flowing the right way. Atari's lawyers had extracted a payment. What Atari had actually done was sign a document establishing that a third party could publish games for the Atari 2600 legally, forever, in exchange for a fee. Read that again. Atari didn't lose a lawsuit. It sold, for a royalty, the right to say no. And every person watching that case understood immediately what it meant. The gate wasn't locked. The gate had a price list. Watch how fast it happens. At the summer 1982 Consumer Electronics Show, 17 companies announced 90 new Atari games in a single week. In June 1982, there were about 100 games for the Atari 2600. By December, 6 months, there were over 400. By 1983, roughly 100 companies were trying to get into a business that, 4 years earlier, exactly one company had been allowed in. Collectors have since counted 158 different vendors that shipped a cartridge for that machine. Some of them were serious, most were not. A dog food company released a game. A cereal brand released a game. There was no approval process, no quality bar, no gatekeeper, because Atari had gone to court and established in writing that there wasn't one. Here's the part that makes it economics rather than bad luck. Atari sold the console close to cost. The money was in the cartridges, a razor and blade business, and a beautiful one, as long as you're the only one allowed to sell blades. After 1982, anyone could sell blades, and they were selling them into shelf space that Atari's own machine had created. So Atari was now paying to grow the installed base of a platform its competitors monetized. Every console it sold at a loss became a customer for somebody else's cartridge. The better Atari's hardware did, the better its rivals did. That is not a competitive disadvantage. That is a business model running in reverse. And Atari's answer to it was the worst possible answer. Make more. In 1982, Atari had the biggest license in the business, Pac-Man, the most famous arcade game on Earth, coming home to the 2600. Atari manufactured 12 million cartridges. There were only about 12 million Atari consoles in existence. Atari had built enough copies of one game for every single machine it had ever sold, including the ones sitting in closets, including the ones that were broken. It sold 7 million, which is astonishing. It's one of the best-selling games of the entire era, and 5 million of them did not sell. 5 million cartridges, paid for, manufactured, shipped, and sitting in a warehouse because the forecast had been made by people who had stopped asking how many customers there were. They were about to do it again, but bigger, and with a movie attached. The head of Warner Communications, Steve Ross, personally made a deal with Steven Spielberg for the home video game rights to E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Atari paid somewhere between $20 and $25 million for that license, for a cartridge that retailed for about 40. Negotiations finished on July 27, 1982. Atari needed the game in stores for Christmas. They gave it to Howard Scott Warshaw, and Warshaw was the right choice. He had written Yar's Revenge, Atari's best-selling original game. They paid him $200,000, and they sent him to Hawaii, and they gave him until September 1st, 5 weeks, to design, build, test, and ship a game carrying the most expensive license in the company's history. He did it. He actually did it. Then Atari decided how many to make. 4 million cartridges. Now, here is the fact that quietly destroys the legend. E.T. sold more than 2.6 million copies by the end of 1982. 2.6 million in about 4 months. That is not a game nobody wanted. By any standard, in any year, that is a hit. The documented returns in 1983 were at least 669,000, and Kassar later claimed that about 3.5 million of the 4 million came back, a number that cannot be squared with the sales figure. So take the low one. Take the one that's on paper. Atari's problem was never that 2.6 million people bought E.T. It was that Atari had ordered 4 million and had nowhere to put the rest, and it had done exactly the same thing with Pac-Man the year before, for exactly the same reason. It was no longer a company that made games. It was a company that made inventory. 4 weeks after that Christmas, the whole thing came apart in a single afternoon. December 7th, 1982, Atari holds a meeting with analysts. The expectation in the room was a profit increase of around 50%. Atari announced 10 to 15. The next day, Warner Communications stock fell about a third, in 1 day. Across 1983, it went from $60 a share to $20, and then the returns started arriving. Not customer returns, retailer returns. The shops sent back what they couldn't sell, and under the deals Atari had signed, Atari had to take them. For 1983, Atari lost $538 million on revenue of about $1.1 billion. About 3,000 people lost their jobs, which brings us back to the desert. By September 1983, Atari had warehouses full of product that no longer had a market, and a tax and accounting problem attached to every unit of it. So the trucks went to Alamogordo. James Heller, the Atari manager who supervised it, later put the number at 728,000 cartridges. And this is the detail that rewrites the whole myth. It wasn't a truckload of one hated game. The Dig in 2014 pulled up Centipede, Asteroids, Pac-Man, consoles, hardware, manuals. Atari didn't bury its mistake, Atari buried its catalog. At the time, the company told reporters it was just damaged stock. Then somebody poured concrete over it, which is not a thing you do to damage stock. July 1st, 1984. Warner Communications gave Atari away. It sold the home computer and console business to Jack Tramiel, the man who had just been forced out of Commodore, and Warner received no cash for it. It took on roughly $240 million in notes and walked away from the division that, 24 months earlier, had been half its revenue. And the market it had defined went with it. US home video game revenue was $3.2 billion in 1982. By 1985, it was around $100 million, a 97% collapse. The industry didn't shrink, it nearly stopped existing. Except that isn't the end, and the ending is the reason any of this matters. In 1985, a Japanese playing card company shipped a console into that wreckage. Nintendo had watched all of it. And inside the Nintendo Entertainment System, they put a chip, a lock in the console, a key in every cartridge. Put in a game without the key, and the machine simply refuses. It reboots over and over, forever. That chip is not a piece of engineering. It's a legal document made of silicon. It meant Nintendo decided who published, how many titles they shipped a year, and whether the game was good enough. Everything the 1982 settlement took away from Atari, Nintendo built into the hardware, where no court could reach it. And the company that fought hardest to break that chip, in court and lost? Atari's arcade division. So what killed Atari? It wasn't a bad game. E.T. sold 2.6 million copies. It wasn't bad luck. Atari sold 12 million machines it had no way to control, and then it went to court and proved it in exchange for a royalty. 4 programmers asked for their names on a box. They were told no, and that no cost the company everything, twice. Once when they left, and once when the settlement they forced turned Atari's own machine into public property. Every license fee you've ever paid, every seal of approval, every app store that decides what you're allowed to install. All of it is the same lesson learned in one afternoon in New Mexico, under 30 feet of dirt and a slab of concrete. The most expensive no in business history. This is Bygonomics. Subscribe. That was Atari. So, who's buried next?